We are indeed very honored to have such a distinguished guest with us, Professor Helliwell, who he's invited me to call him John, so I will carry on with that. Thank you very much. I have to say that when Courtney first told us at the board that he wanted to bring in somebody to talk about the World Happiness Report, I was a little skeptical. Maybe some of you were too when you first saw it, because the world's in a pretty sorry state. And I thought, really? We're going to talk about global happiness? And I don't know, there's quite a few of you in the room are about the same age as I am. Do you remember back in the 70s when there were beauty pageants, and every time they had a contestant on the stage answering questions about her life goals, at the very end, she would put a very sincere expression on her face and earnestly gaze into the camera and say, "And world peace." Do you remember that? That's what it made me think of. And I thought, really? And I'm also a college professor, as was mentioned. And one of the things that I have really had to work at with my students in the past decades is helping them to understand that you need to check the credibility of what you hear, right? We have a deluge of information that comes from not so filtered sources. So we really do have to check the credentials. Well, believe me, this guy has lots of credentials. And when I found out I was going to be interviewing today instead of our good friend Joanna Puros, who normally does this work, of course I started looking at the World Happiness Report and finding out just what is this and who's behind it. And should I believe what it's saying? Well, yes. You heard a little bit from Courtney about who's behind it. Some pretty big, hard-hitting names, some pretty reputable, trustworthy sources, lots and lots of data gathered in very scientific and credible manner. So I'm convinced, but I still have a couple of questions to start out with, John, if you don't mind. The first is, how the heck did you decide how to define happiness?
When I got seriously into this field, I said, well, I better go back to original sources. So I went back and read Aristotle on this because it was he who in the modern age was most focused on defining happiness. And he said, if you want to know about happiness, you should get someone in a reflective moment and ask them to think about their life as a whole. And I said, okay. And he then listed a number of things that he thought would lead people to give a high evaluation of their lives now and over time. At the end of that list, he said, if these things pass the test of what goes on in the world, then take them seriously. Otherwise, they're just talk. So we now have the data to answer those questions. So I appointed myself Aristotle's research assistant. And I got a fellowship back to Oxford to say, okay, I'm going to do it. And that's how I got into the field, well before the World Happiness Report. So that put me in a position when things like this started to happen, being there to do something about it. I haven't answered any questions that you may want to ask about how you actually measure it, but that's where I got the basic definition.
Well, that seems like a pretty credentialed resource to me, Aristotle. I'm not going to argue with that one.
Always work for the best people.
Indeed. Best people you can find. Okay, so we know a little bit about who and why this data was gathered, but why is it important? What does it tell us, and how do we use this data?
If you take this stuff seriously, then it will change the way you run your life. It will change the way you want organizations run that you deal with. It will change the kind of thing you'd like to have people say who are asking for your electoral support at any level. It'll change the way you behave on your next drive to work. So it's right from the beginning to the end of your life. Because what we've discovered with this research is that the all-important support for a good life is close, trusting, helpful, and helping social connections. It dominates everything else. And it's more than that. It's that when people do feel they're with people whom they can trust and whom they like and whom they have fun with, they do a lot better job at anything they were otherwise doing. And of course, once those lights went on to me, I then started going into every caring discipline, every caring measure. They said, what do we know about what actually happens there that says, yes, this is really important, or no, it's an idea, but it doesn't have any reality. Well, let me give you one example. Atul Gawande, a wonderful writer, doctor, and he has written books. His book, Being Mortal, if you haven't read it, you ought to. It is as deep as they come. But he was a leader in developing a system to avoid accidents in the operating room. And so they said, if pilots get trained with multiple procedures and multiple checks, isn't there anything we can learn for operating rooms where equally important and life-threatening accidents can happen? And so they did these experiments all over the world of a substantial extent. And I dug into all this literature, and lo and behold, at my reading of literature, right, you always get a little bit what you want out of what you read. But in terms of the places where it had really worked and materially reduced the level of things going wrong in an operating procedure, the most important aspect was what they gather around the operating table and they drop their masks and they introduce themselves to each other and then discuss what it is they're doing together. It was that human linking and flattening of that power structure. Imagine what an operating room power structure looks like. Normally, it's very top down, and the surgeon could cut your wrist and you wouldn't say anything about it. But in a flat structure, you said, well, we're all in this together. This is our procedure and our patient. And we can't get the patient help. That turns out to be a very important part elsewhere. But in the operating room, that's not so much. But in fact, it was that part of the flattening of the structure that allowed the team to become a team, to work together, that was the most important part. You see it everywhere.
That's quite remarkable. I hope our operating room staff are doing that every time. So we know that this report is published essentially annually, and it's about 150 countries globally that participate.
Well, the countries really don't participate.
Right.
The data comes from the Gallup World Poll, which was founded in 2005 by the Gallup leader of the time. And I think one of the other editors and I were drawn in to help advise on the content, along with Danny Kahneman, one of the leading figures in the field. And he took the view, Jim Clifton, that you can't focus on something unless you have the information. You can't elevate it to importance. And he said the reason people pay attention to GDP is because it's measured and talked about. And it then becomes something you can compare your progress with to somebody else. There's a whole lot of sort of throwaway lines about it. If you measure it, you treasure it, et cetera, et cetera. But it turns out to be true. There was no comparable measure of a nation's success in collectively producing good lives for each other that came anything close to the kind of economic measures that were dominating the headlines. And if you really believe with Aristotle or anybody, when you ask them seriously, what makes you happiest in your life, you're not going to say how rich you are. Nobody does that, because we now have lots of cross-checks of that. But if you want to get a broader measure of success, and if you believe my original screed about Aristotle, you're going to then want to collect these life evaluations from people all over the world. And that's what Jim Clifton committed. Gallup, he said, this is not just for now. We're going to do this for a century. And it may take a century before this new information is sufficiently understood and appreciated and then fed out to what goes on in countries. Because the Gallup World polls only 1,000 people a year in each country. You really want to know what life is like in Sechelt. You want to know what life is like in Bouscapé. You certainly want to know what life is urban and rural, people of different demographic categories, immigrants born in the country, you name it. You can't do that unless you get national statistical agencies seeing the light and then saying, what's the point of measuring all these things we ask about in our census unless we put them to work in helping us to understand how good people's quality of life is? Fortunately, Canada was, I think, now the first country that got life evaluations into their major social survey in about 1980, I think. And gradually, as this understanding and beliefs, and more people were convinced that this wasn't just airy-fairy stuff, it was, in fact, a way of measuring the quality of people's lives, that it then became necessary and possible to get collection. Now, national statisticians don't like subjective questions. We had the first meeting in 2008 of national statistical agencies brought together in Florence to talk about measuring life evaluations, essentially measuring well-being. There's now a new, led 5 years later to a report about this for national statistical offices. It was a hard sell to get them to take it seriously. And so you had to use various tricks to bring them on board, sort of take people and force them to look at the world through fresh eyes. It takes a while.
Yeah. John, you brought out the Canada's ranking. And so I think one of the burning questions is probably in most people's minds here is, how did we do? How did we rank on the World Happiness Report this year?
It is one of the puzzles that collectively here you may have some views on, or we may have some views on. Within Canada, the first important thing to know is that we discovered a quiet happiness revolution. And so 40 years ago, people in Quebec were very much less happy than elsewhere in the country. In the succeeding 40 years, that gap has disappeared, and the happiest people in the country are now in Quebec and the Maritimes. And was it related to higher incomes? No, because it was related to all of the sort of ordinary things people thought about. It wasn't that. And so what does it feed back to? You remember on the Quebec license plates, it used to say Maître chez nous. In those 40 years, Québécois have become Maître chez nous, that they're in their own communities and sharing the decision-making in life more equally and openly among people of differing backgrounds. It shows you what a difference it makes. You have to feel at home and that the people with whom you relate cover your back and you cover theirs. If you have a separated society, that's very hard to achieve.
Can you tell us what Canada's ranking was globally?
I know. See, I have a tendency to, Millie says, give answers that are too long, but that's one issue.
It's my job here. Keep you on track. Come on.
I gave you a good happiness news about Canada, but in part because that quiet revolution was more or less completed by the time the World Happiness Report first came out. Canada was number 4, I think, in the first report out of 150 countries. We've been slowly drifting down ever since.
Oh, that's not good news.
So in the most recent report, we are 15th. The United States, with which Canadians always compare themselves. That's the first thing. And maybe it's because they get American media dumped on them. It may be or close, right? And they have family and friends who share experiences. But Canada's always been happier than the United States. And in the 6 variables we use in the report to explain differences in happiness, income per capita, healthy life expectancy, having someone to count on in times of trouble, degree of trust of each other, a sense of freedom to make your key life decisions, and generosity as measured by doing things for others. Then and now, the United States ranked materially above Canada in income per capita, and Canada ranked materially above the United States in all those other factors. That was the reason why Canada was number 4. And in the first report, the U.S. was number 11. They similarly have dropped in the succeeding years of the report. And so they were, and it made a lot of headlines in the U.S., especially this year, because they were not even in the top 20. They were at 23rd. And so one of the things that bears discussion is why this drop in North America. It's mirrored a little bit in Australia and New Zealand. And it's not just other people jumping up through us in happiness. There's an actual drop going on in Canada and the United States. And an extra twist to that, it's especially among millennials and post-millennials, or alternatively, a divide by age group, people under 30.
Well, actually, that's the next thing I wanted to focus on, John. Thanks for bringing that up. When I took a look at the World Happiness Report, there were 5 themes that emerged that are reported on: happiness across life stages, child and adolescent happiness, the relationship between well-being and dementia, and a study of happiness among older adults in India in particular. So I wanted to delve more carefully into 2 of those themes. And the first one is this unexpected drop in the levels of self-reported happiness among adolescents in North America in particular. What do you speculate might be causing that, and what are the implications of it going forward?
Well, the first thing that's in all the press, right? If you read a lot of the best-selling books and whatever, it's the social media stupid. I mean, that's stealing a line from others. And we indeed had a chapter 5 or 6 years ago on the effect of social media use on adolescent females. And in the U.S., this is where most of this research has been done. And there were these are real effects and big. And so then you say, well, that's what it's all about. Now, the thing about the World Happiness Report is we don't just focus on the United States and Canada. We go right around the world. And so then I was giving a talk earlier this year in Switzerland, and in the part of Switzerland that's right down in Italy. So I was looking at Italy and Switzerland both, and looking at social media use among the young in Canada, the United States, Switzerland, and Italy. Social media use is even higher in Italy than it is in the United States and among the young than it is in the United States and Canada. They're not getting less happy. So it isn't the social media and the use of them, it's how they're used, I think, and what you make of it and what information you get from those media. And there's a sort of, if you want a sort of moral coming out of this, one is that this happened very quickly. So it only started, and of course the correlation is there, is about the time the smartphones came in and became ubiquitous. But any mental change that happens in broad opinion, that happens that quickly, it's not something that can't be reversed, right? Especially if it happens only in some countries and not others, even though the technology is universal. In fact, relative to what you otherwise do, it's in the less developed parts of the world where these technologies have been most life-changing, because now anyone can go to university anywhere, if you like, in a way that simply wasn't possible before. So that good news is it's isolated, and it's probably came quickly, so it could be solved just about as fast. But then you have to know what to do about it and how to do about it. Everything depends on how you yourself interpret your own life. And this is, I moved from hard data to soft guesswork now, right? Because we've exposed these trends, and now we have to ask everybody and other researchers to help us understand them better. What are the terms and conditions under which and what types of social media use, and indeed other media, affects how people feel about their lives? I think the quality, the trust of what you hear is declining as information sources have been broader, more polarized, and in general less believed, because you say, well, I think this and you think that, and what are your facts? And you each give the facts, and the facts aren't the same facts, and they're both supposed to be facts. So you get this dissonance. And the creation of happiness requires the removal of dissonance. It's about making connections with real conversations. The immediate reaction to the diffuse networks is to draw back and say, I don't trust you, I don't want to talk to you. The lesson from the happiness research is that's exactly the wrong reaction. So that you don't make war, you make peace, going back to your 1970s. But to make peace, you have to make connections. It won't happen without it. This is as true of any reconciliation process. Is that enough on that issue? I want to talk about the older age group too, which was of equal importance, but you probably want me to as well.
Well, that's mostly what I was looking for, but I sort of a corollary question. This cohort that have this dip in happiness, I mean, I heard you say that it could be reversed just as quickly, for whatever reasons had caused it. So I guess what I'm hearing is that it's not sort of a cohort-based thing. That group of people isn't going to be unhappy throughout their lives just because they tested as having a dip in happiness during that youth and adolescence time.
We don't know.
We don't know.
Too soon. I mean, it's only now with, say, about 15 to 20 years of the reports, we can separate age effects from cohort effects, right? Because you really need to study a lot of generations or multiple generations moving through life stages to separate whether it's something that happened in 2006 or whether it's something that happens to teenagers, right? You can eventually break that apart. And we don't know yet what the scars are of feeling badly about your life at one stage. My guess is that because it hasn't happened everywhere, then it's about the particular information those young people have got and what they make of it. You see, it's all very well to hear bad news and hear of problems. It makes you feel down if you think nothing's ever going to get better. But if you think there are open doors for you to make things better, starting tomorrow, not waiting until somebody up there in a capital changes their mind and does things differently, things you can do to make these social connections happy, then it changes the world.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the
smile
other
time.
Yeah, indeed. Let's talk about the other end of the spectrum. I was really encouraged by the findings you had about the connection between happiness and cognitive decline and dementia. Tell us that good news.
The thing that surprised me most about what we found, we've been struggling for years to get a chapter on India, right? Because we've had chapters on the United States, more than one, on the Nordic countries, obviously, because they've been top, on China twice, but never India, which is the biggest country in the world. So I said, how can that be? And so we ended up finding a nice set of scholars in India coupled with a very nice later life survey. It's going to be longitudinal, but they were using the first few waves about life people over 50 in India. And they were surprised to find that among those hundreds of thousands of people, you see, this is way better than the Gallup World Poll in terms of digging deep, right? They had scores of thousands of people, that in each of the age groups they looked at from 50 and above, right through, as people got older, they got happier. And then that raises a puzzle. Because if you go into the report and say, what does determine how happy people are looking across people? Maybe anyway, there are a lot of things that are really important, but one of the primary ones is physical health. Well, we know how people rate their physical health and the existence of health problems, sort of the same thing. It goes steadily down through the life course, steadily down. We know it's very important. We know that social connections, the warmth of social connections and the breadth of them and the opportunities of it are at least as important as the health status. And we know from data that among these older populations, the extent to which they have the capacity to have social networks of the breadth they had before, for one reason or another, is less. He said, wait a minute, how could this be true? And so, fortunately, there were some psychologists who 25 years ago, just for a slightly different reason, were asking, in some sense, the same thing in midlife. You see, there's a sort of a you start out happy, that's held to be a you, very happy, a young, middle-aged stress, less happy, and then you climb out of it afterwards. But if you actually then look at the data, you say, why are you climbing out of it afterwards? Now you're getting rid of your midlife stresses, that's part of it for sure. But all these key determinants like health and breadth of social connections are getting worse. How can you be getting happier? Well, it's been called the positivity effect. Now, in order to tell you about the positivity effect, I have to tell you first about the negativity bias. It's sort of, what makes you scared of snakes, right? People pay more attention to bad things. They're likely to remember them more. And that's sort of built into the DNA. It's argued in an evolutionary sense. It keeps you out of trouble, right? But the evolution has gone on long enough that it's making things worse, not better. Danny Kahneman used to say there's type 1 thinking and type 2 thinking, and type 1 fast brain is the one that says you jump up when you see a snake and see something bad, you react and disappear. Type 2 thinking is you say, wait a minute, let's put it all together. Well, this negativity bias, whichever parts of the brain it's coming from, is prevalent. And it's been well studied, and everybody has it. And so you can't just blame it on the news media. It's true of them. If it bleeds, it leads. They haven't even thought about it this way. If we, the readers, want a balanced view of how life is, we want to be able to get it from our media because we have our own experience, but to get a broader one, we rely on the media. But if the media continually tells you about bad things happening, but never tells you about the good ones, then you form a biased view of the world. And we know, of course, from happiness studies, to have a negatively biased view of the world is awful. Why is it awful? Because it makes you feel nervous, bad, scared. But more than that, it leads you to draw back and not to reach out and connect with others. Let me give you one startling fact that is in the report. It's going to be big in this year's report we're making. The theme this year is going to be caring and sharing. And so it's all about what brings people together. One of the key pieces of evidence is that wallets have been dropped experimentally all over the world. And we finally got into the Gallup World Poll in one round asking the question, how likely is it if your wallet was lost that it would be returned if it was found by A, a neighbor, B, a police officer, or C, a stranger? And we have answers from pretty big samples all over the world. And we have answers from one of the Canadian surveys from all over Canada. The Toronto Star dropped 20 wallets in Toronto without realizing they were contributing to science. They just thought it was a fun thing to do because Reader's Digest had previously done it somewhere else. And of those wallets were dropped in Toronto, 16 out of 20 were returned. Okay, you say, gosh, that's wonderful. But what's not so wonderful is that the surveys we had from those same Toronto neighborhoods said the average likelihood they expected was 1/4. And so it means the world we live in, is a hell of a lot kinder and more socially connected and more filled with pro-social actions, motives, and consequences than we know. And that's crucially expensive. So that's why when I talk about this to anybody, regardless of how you started the question, I twist the conversation to show what has to be done is not just to find out what current levels of life evaluations are, but to find out what is important in making them better. And first of all, we knew that how benevolent you thought your environment was critically important. Well, this year we've got some new data coming in from the European Social Survey where they ask people, in general, do you think people are fair and do you think they're kind? And people who think they're fair and kind on this 10-point scale are 1 point happier than those who don't. And if you're unemployed or discriminated against or sick, the effect is that much greater. So not only this kind of feeling that you're in a benevolent environment is not only helps your own happiness, it helps everybody's happiness and reduces the inequality of happiness. Those are all great things. But in order to do that, we have to spread the word, right? You have to go out and say, I just heard this afternoon that wallets are returned at least twice as often as you think they will. So the moral is, treat those people you see in the streets who would pick up your wallet and return it to you. That's not just trustworthiness. That's not just honesty. It's benevolence, right? It's stepping out of a busy life in order to do something to make someone else's life better. Well, that's the number one source for happiness. Well, we have to believe people are as good as they are, and we're shooting ourselves in the foot by thinking people are not trustworthy when they are. Now, we can talk about the extent to which media enforces that, but that's a separate question.
Well, I just wanted to tell a short story about one of our directors who's in the room here today. His wife told me yesterday when I bumped into her in the library, they had an experience which illustrates both of your points here. Their car was bumped into in a parking lot, and the driver who bumped into them took off, not having left any information, insurance information or anything. However, that's the bad part. However, 2 young women who happened to see this not only took the license plate down, but wrote a note for our friends, and not just leaving it under the windshield wiper. They stayed with the car until our friends came back because they were afraid that the guy would have seen them putting the note and would come back and remove it. So these 2 young women took time out of their day to stand there and wait till our friends came back so that they could be sure that they got the information they needed to make that insurance claim against that driver who'd hit their car. So the world is more benevolent than we'd like to believe. And among young people, I thought that was a very encouraging story. I did want to come back, though, to my original question. I saw in the report that there was a relationship between the happiness measure and the onset of cognitive decline, that it staves it off is basically what it said. Is that correct?
Oh, you betcha. And when you think about it, if you think there's lots to live for and everything's going to be happy, it gives you the spirit to carry on through thick or thin, to have people who are in facilities thinking that they have a purpose and they have people there helping. That's why we study putting school classes into elder care facilities. These are 2 groups that need each other badly, and we imprison them both in their own institutions and deny a better world for all of them. These things are critically important, but I didn't answer part of that, did I?
Well, I think you did. I mean, is there an actual? Does it stave off dementia? Is there data to say that happier people are less likely?
In the course of studying this iGen project in Saskatoon, of course, that's one of the things we looked at, is what's happening to lives of these older people, and so on. But there's a lot of big sample work done by some epidemiologists who I work with and mainly in Toronto, where they take people's life assessments to year X, then they link them with all their subsequent health records. What happens to those people? And of course, because it comes from Canada's National Health Survey, we know all about their health conditions at the first point and what happens afterwards. Taking account of all the initial health problems people have, to have a stronger view about your life, a higher life evaluation, cuts your mortality and morbidity significantly. Now, the chapter on dementia in this year's report was focusing quite explicitly on that channel. But there are many other channels. There's a whole range of health conditions that are mediated by how happy your life is. I mean, it's partly how you think about what's wrong with you, but it's much more importantly what you think about life as well. It makes sense, right? If you have a reason to live and a happy reason to live, it'll defend you against a lot.
Yeah, boost your immune system for sure. You mentioned that you're going to be looking at caring and sharing in the next edition, and in previous editions of the report or interviews, you've talked about this. There is a relationship between altruism and generosity and happiness. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It's one of the things Aristotle didn't say very much about, surprisingly, because it jumps out of the data. And now, of course, psychologists are looking at this. What are the conditions under which benevolence helps? And the answer is, if you're helping someone whom you feel connected to, whose life matters to you, those kind of warmth of connections are important. You have to believe in what you're doing. You have to believe it's well managed if the benevolence is going through third parties. And you don't want to know that it'll make you happy. That's bad. That's one of the big puzzles, right? Because it will make you happy, but if you think it'll make you happy, then you question your own motives and saying, I'm just being kind because it'll make me feel happy. Therefore, I'm selfish and I don't get the warm glow. So I've run into this countless times, and I have to explain to people. I said, stand up, go a few hundred feet in the air, and look at what's happening in the lives of people you're being kind to. If you're kind to someone, what's the chances of them being more likely to be kind to others? Way up. Is their life better? Yes. Are they going to make other people's life? You're not going to say, because you feel a little bit guilty about feeling happy, you're going to deny other people's happiness and create a better world? No, of course you aren't. So you have to say, just get up and get on with it. Say, I'm doing this to help other people. If I get sent a little bonus of happiness, that's just life. But nice part of life. I think.
For sure. Well, of course, we at the Foundation really like that fine about altruism. You mentioned very briefly about the Scandinavian countries ranking really highly consistently, and particularly Finland. And I read that they didn't at first believe that they ranked so highly. They didn't describe themselves as happy despite the results. In fact, I heard that in Finland, when COVID restrictions came in and they were asked to stand 2 meters apart, they wanted to know why they couldn't just stick to their usual 4 meters apart. So they don't think they're so happy, but they are. Tell us why.
Well, it's charming. Finland was significantly less happy than Canada in the first reports. It's come up through the ranks. And it's come up through the ranks of the Nordic countries too. And this is one of the interesting things. And so there are scholars comparing life across the Nordic countries. And it's still true that the Finns are less materialistic even than the other Nordic countries. They care less about income comparisons and so on. They take pride in the fact that the sauna they've got isn't fancy and everyone has a cottage that's nothing special, and it doesn't bother them, while other places they sort of want to have something better. So that's part of it. And of course, that leads you to think, if someone says you're the happiest, of course we aren't, right? I mean, it's a genuine modesty. But then you ask, well, how do you feel about life, and what are the kinds of things you enjoy about Finland? And then they list things, and then if, like a Finnish couple who visited in Vancouver for 2 or 3 years, when they were studying, because she's a public health person who studies happiness and trying to get it more embodied in medical care, she was asked to make a presentation to a joint Finnish-Canadian research group. We were studying precisely this issue. And one of the lovely pictures in that picture was a 6-year-old girl holding the hand of her 3-year-old brother walking to school in downtown Helsinki. Mm-hmm. Well, now in many countries of the world, people wouldn't just shake their heads, it would be illegal. Mm. And so that tells you it's that kind of society where every block has 100 parents on it. So you're everybody's parent, you're everybody's friend. When Reader's Digest dropped those wallets, they were all returned in Helsinki. Huh. And that's a big the number of wallets returned varies a lot across countries. And Nordic countries are all high, but I think Finland is the highest of all. Well, and people say it's because they have cradle-to-the-grave social policies and so on. But that's because they care about each other. It isn't that the happiness comes from those programs. They just say, well, surely everyone should have the same education, and it should be good education. Surely everybody should have access to good health care, and it should be good health care, etc. So they make sure that they look after each other through their public institutions. But public institutions don't return wallets, you see, and it's that wallet return that you could imagine numbers people like me. We said, does how you think about the wallet return make you happy? And the answer is, you bet it does.
Sure.
You bet it does, independent of what your government is doing or anything else. So somehow they've managed to build, and it wasn't there 2 centuries ago, you can be sure. So like everyone else, they've started from lives that were seriously shorter and more brutal than now. But the social norms have evolved in a way that's and that's the beauty of this report, is to focus attention on these countries you otherwise wouldn't have focused on, to ask yourself, how can we make our lives for each other better, learning from them? And that's one of those things.
Well, you've led me very nicely to my second last question, talking about public institutions and how can we get better at this, world happiness idea. What can public institutions do? What can government and community leaders do? How can they use this information to make their constituents happier, make their community a happier place?
Well, in a very narrow sense, we have to train the professionals in every discipline so as to understand how the importance of how people relate to each other and deal with each other fundamentally affects what they can achieve together, the imagination they collectively can get, the results they can collectively achieve, and how happy they are with what they've got. And that's as important in a school classroom as in an operating room, as in a prison, as in any institution you can think of. So governance is about how we run all our institutions, and it's you and me, it's the family, it's the neighborhood, it's everywhere, and everybody's got their points of leverage. And so policy is what people do. I don't like us to make it a them and us, that they are going to do things that will make us happy. That ain't the way it works. And the primary reason is that your happiness depends very much on what goes on in your daily life, close in.
Well, that's the last question. If you had to tell me 2 things I could do to make myself happier in my day-to-day life, what would they be?
I would ask you to reformulate the question.
Okay, ask it for me.
Because it's the wrong question. Now, almost every airport book has that subject. What can I do to make myself happier? I said, no, that's the wrong question. Happiness is not a goal for individuals to seek. Happiness is a consequence of a life well lived. So you say, what can I do to live my life in a way that will help people, make them happier, help them to be happier? How can I work together with people to build something together? It can be a hospital, it can be a new treatment, it can be a better playground, it could be, you name it, right? It's in every aspect of life. So I think Millie will remember some talks where I just say, on your next elevator ride, don't treat it as a prison where you watch the telephone. I watch your cell phone now. It used to be you'd watch the registration certificate on the side of the elevator. But start a conversation. And there are a number of stories, and I asked them to report back, of course. There's not many elevators here in Sechelt, thank goodness. On the street, it's easier. So on the street, the next people you see, greet them with a smile and not that. See what it does, because those connections are positive feedback connections, and everybody can do them, right? And my guess is it'll turn out pretty well. If it isn't, let me know.
Okay. Well, those are pretty good thoughts to end on. And I know Jane is now going to take over and get a few more questions for John to answer for us. Go ahead, Jane.
Well, we had one before the session even started. So just to start with a bit of a heavy one, there's a question submitted. How does a community find happiness after and even during a genocide?
The best measure of a happy community, a successful community, is how it handles bad times. And we've studied genocides, but we've also studied earthquakes and natural disasters of other kinds, and indeed behavior during COVID. All things, bad things happening, and it's how people deal with it that's critical. Unfortunately, there are too many world examples of genocides to study. We found on the encouraging side that although the awful genocidal activity, frankly, to use the same word, in the Balkans in 1993 was just awful, and it clearly tore families, communities, and lives apart. The scars are still evident in terms of happiness among some of the people who were directly involved. The encouraging thing is that it is possible to put it behind you and build something better in the future. So we find the young people in those countries have come right out of that slough of despond. In Rwanda, it has not happened so quickly. After natural disasters, we find it happens very quickly. And the reason it happens very quickly, and where it happens very quickly, it's because people find out that other people are nicer than they thought they were, right? And so if you're in a place where everybody's rushing out to help other people, you say, goodness gracious, I'm delighted to live in a place where people come out to help each other that way. And they hadn't thought about it before because of that negativity bias, but they see it, and that's what COVID did. There was an increase in helping of strangers all over the world. And that was one of the reasons people didn't get less happy with their lives during COVID. They saw that. And not only did their own actions help, but they saw other people doing that, and they said, good for us. And that makes you feel good. And so I hope that's an answer to that question. It said how you deal with it during and after. Well, because you want to stop it is first. That's the most important thing. Peace is the precondition. But in order to achieve that, and in order to get reconciliation after, you have to talk to each other and find out what people's deeper needs are. Get beyond the rhetoric, get beyond the blame, get beyond the backward looking. It's a key element to happy lives. This is the positivity effect I was talking about earlier. You don't ignore bad things that have happened, but you learn from them, put them in a drawer, and don't open that drawer. And you then open the drawer of the memories of people working with and for each other. And that kind of is what you have to do in the consequence.
I think seeing... It's not working. Oh, there we go. I think seeing young Emberley on the stage helps us to feel that the next generation perhaps will show some healing, and that we are getting somewhere towards that reconciliation and healing.
Absolutely. There are marvelous examples right throughout in many, many Indigenous communities. You hear about the communities where things have gone very wrong. You don't hear about the ones where things are going very right because of the way we tell our stories. And there's a whole, I'm not going to get into it this week. Back to questions.
More questions Jane's got.
I have about 30 of them here, so we're going to try to get to them as many as possible. Question, how has the pandemic impacted happiness? And are we better now on a happiness scale after such a challenge?
More or less unchanged. Now, when we first came out, in the first report where we knew what people's happiness was like in 2020, there was no drop. And so people said, it just shows your measures are no good or something, But we knew the measures were good because we saw when bad things really did happen, they did take people down and vice versa. And so we put our spectacles on and then said, well, what's going better than had gone before to offset? See, lives were torn asunder. People focus on, I can't be at school, I'm not seeing my friends, I can't go to my regular job, I may be unemployed, I'm in danger, and I lost my grandmother. All right, so you've got all these things that are bad things. You say, well, yes, the lives were torn asunder, but then what happened? It turns out that most of the families that were unwillingly, or anyway, they were all jammed in their apartments or houses and forced to create a little mini community, they all learned something from, not all, you see, because you hear about the ones that blew up in splendor, which can happen. But on average, people were finding that there was more benevolence out there than they thought there was, that they really enjoyed. They were, first of all, you say the people who should have been hurt most are the elders who were locked away and they were suffering most in health terms, and their networks constrained. They couldn't get out. They didn't suffer at all. In fact, relatively, they even grew a bit. And the reason was, of course, that everybody reached out to help others, and within families, it was almost universal that everyone put Zoom to good use. And so the social media, which were decried at that time for what they did to social relations among adolescent girls, were in fact becoming social media. They were a way to make contacts. I do lots of interviews, and I ask media people often, do you get better from the telephone or the video? And they said, there's no question about it. I'm sure you all found the same thing. So this immediacy, and of course you can do it across the continent. And so there's, in fact, tighter knitting of families when you'd say everything made it impossible, but it didn't. And benevolence, right? I'd already told you the benevolence grew during COVID. That's that part of the story I already knew.
Okay, there's a question here. Could you please talk about the gross national happiness of Bhutan that was once upon a time quite well publicized versus profit? And was it a part of the report this year? Why or why not?
Well, the history of the report, and I think I've given the foundation a historical piece in an encyclopedia that they can share with anyone who wants to see it, about how the report came about. Bhutan was absolutely central to that process. They had been treating gross national happiness as a national objective since the late 1980s, and they started holding gross national happiness international conferences right at the beginning of this century, and I was lucky enough to get to one of the first ones in Nova Scotia. And they then were the sponsors of a UN resolution to the General Assembly in 2011, sponsored by Prime Minister Thinley, who was the first elected Prime Minister of Bhutan. The nation should make the happiness and well-being of their citizens a national objective. And that then led to a whole lot of other things, including, we wrote this report so there'd be some scientific basis for that meeting, which itself was held as a consequence of the UN resolution. So without Bhutan, it probably wouldn't have happened. So prizes everywhere for Bhutan. Now, they say, well, that makes Bhutan the happiest country in the world. I said, well, not really. It is. They did wonderfully during COVID, by the way, that they were better at getting the right mix of keeping infections down and medically treating appropriately people, even though they're a very country with lots of international links or tourism and a very small population and very poor. So they've got something, they're making that work. We don't get them in the report very often, and that's because they won't let the survey back in. And I'm disappointed in that because I have lots of friends there, and there's a little conflict between those who say, well, we measure happiness differently, so they define people as happy or not according to how they rank on various indicators. As you could imagine, for us, that's not the way we do things. We want people's own assessments, and that's the primary thing. And we'd love to get back in Bhutan. They're still leaders in a lot of issues. They're facing all the modern issues. They're the most rapidly urbanizing country in the world, if you could believe it. If you've been to Paro recently or Thimphu, you'd see. And they've got all the problems. We have a population still well less than 1 million. They're happier than their neighboring countries. Are they happier than the happiest countries? Well, no. So they're really important. Do I blame them for not being the happiest country? Well, of course not. How could I?
I'm going to combine two questions here. Are you aware of any studies linking emotional intelligence to happiness? And while you're at it, what is the role of expectations in happiness?
Oh boy, those are
it's a double barrel,
deep and important questions. If my wife Millie is ever in the audience, I have to. The first thing I always say is that I study happiness; she produces it. Which
yay, Millie! Yay, Millie!
and that to explain that in part, it's because she's got an EQ like you wouldn't believe, and to have an EQ, remember it takes you out and doesn't force you, but it leads you to take the other people seriously, warmly and seriously. Well, that's a big boost to happiness. Now, you could imagine some people with high EQ, they're overly sensitive about the wrong things, and that then takes them down rather than up. But you get EQ with a warm heart like Millie's, then it means that they make people happier wherever they are. On that local scale, which, as I've argued continuously, is where it all happens. So super important.
Excellent.
Oh, wait a minute. There was a second half to that. Expectations. Really important. And when you think about it, it's natural, right? Are people happier or not according to the actual rate of criminal activity in their country or what they think it'll be? The actual rate of wallet return or what they think it will be? Their actual state of health or what they think their state of health is? In all of those cases, and for good reason, it's your expectations about the features of the world you live in that drive your happiness. There's another sort of set of issues we won't have time for about relativities and comparing yourself to other people. I think we can avoid that.
Well, here's a question for you personally, John. Are you happier now as a result of your research, or have you always been this happy? And did you have a moment of epiphany in your conversations with Aristotle, or like any other insights on sort of what puts you on this path to happiness?
I
have an awesome audience, by the way.
I can answer this in 30 seconds or 10 minutes.
30 seconds.
I thought that was going to be the case. The answer is yes. And the epiphany wasn't Aristotle so much as to his instruction to go and dig deeper into it. And the epiphany I got was when I realized all the things I was learning for the data helped me to explain what I'd always admired but never quite understood, how Millie generates these circles of happiness wherever she goes. And it says, wait a minute, these are all things that we now know are absolutely what creates happiness everywhere. And I said, well, wait a minute. What she does, I can do, right? So I am now much more like her than I was 50 years ago. And I not only is it just I like being like her, but I've now found through the research, because that was the question, right? What have I learned from the research? That this is the way life ought to be lived. And so it's up to all of us. If you believe what I say today, you'll go out and not say, oh, that was fun, and go back and do tomorrow what you did yesterday. Tomorrow you'll do a whole lot of things differently. Because if you believe me, you have to do things differently, right?
Okay, one more question on a reference to the India story. You started to tell us why the older people there were so happy. Can you expand on that?
Sure. People thought, we found this, people getting happier as they got older, and we relied on this positivity effect. People are getting smarter as they get older, right? So they focus less on the negatives and more on the positives. They're less likely to assume the person they're dealing with is a bad person than a good person. And that leads them to reach out more, to farm over their social contexts and put away the bad ones and use the good ones. You see, that's what explains why with less social contact, the older people are actually happier with their social context than other people. And that's because they're curating them and they're ignoring the bad memories and emphasizing the good ones. People said that's going to make old people subject to scams. There's a whole lot of people, as you might imagine, saying old people are going to get talked out of their homes by these scammers. So a graduate student of great brilliance at Simon Fraser in psychology said, I can test that. So she set up a scam. Because you can set up a scam because they're all done by computer-generated stuff anyway, and did it for an old sample and a young sample. Now, within the old sample, those who had cognitive decline or didn't know how to open their computer did worse at the scams, but nonetheless, the old sample was less likely to be scammed than the young sample. So that's telling you, although they're taking a more positive view, they're not checking their brain at the door. They're using the extra wisdom about connecting more with people to develop their EQ, to have their ears open for things that are wrong. But that doesn't mean just saying I'm distrust everybody. So that's what you ideally want, right? You want these open, warm connections and still not get run over by a bus.
Thank you very much.